Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Saudi Arabia race ratings. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. Also, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below for more F1 content. Do leave any feedback and suggestions in the comments, then hopefully this series can get better with every race. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with the result, and after a great battle in the closing laps, it's Max Verstappen that takes his first win of 2022. Behind him, just half a second away in the end, Charles Leclerc, and then P3 Carlos Sainz making a double podium for Ferrari in a row, and poor Sergio Perez finishing fourth through no fault of his own. With the race, I don't know about you guys, but it felt a little similar in Bahrain to me, with a lot of going on at the start, followed by a bit of a dull patch, and then just complete chaos at the end, which I can't really complain about. Glad as well we didn't see any big accidents. That was a big talking point coming into the race. Just a couple of drivers tangling with each other a little bit, or in Latifi's case, the wall. But yeah, on the whole, I think I'm going to give it an 8.5, very nearly a 9. I gave Bahrain an 8, which in hindsight was maybe a half point too high, as Saudi Arabia was a little above it. You know, we had a lot of action at the front, some battles through the order, and generally a good race. I'll start with Williams, and I think overall they'll be disappointed. You know, both cars not finishing, and generally the pace wasn't there this weekend, same as before. It doesn't look too good for them. With the drivers, I'll start with Latifi, and it was just bad. The notes I made literally go lap 13 slow, lap 16 crash, and the fact that he crashed on his own only a third of the way through the race is just poor. From the looks of things, he just started to lose the rear end midway through turn 27, overcorrected, and then went straight into the wall. Rating wise, it's probably a 1, maybe 1.5. I guess he didn't take anyone out with his crash, but to be at the back every lap and then lose it on your own, I don't think you could have done much worse. Moving to Albon, and it was definitely more encouraging, was ahead of Latifi all the time they were both on track and was running in the points for just a little bit after Magnussen and Hamilton came in. Pace-wise, the car still isn't great, but was still in the fight with those around him. Obviously, then had the collision with Stroll, which netted him a 3-place penalty for Melbourne, just a bit too optimistic down the inside. So I think overall, it's going to be a 4.5. Pace-wise was okay, but then had the collision at the end, which just drags the rating down. Moving then to Aston Martin, and I don't really know what to say. The pace was a little bit better than last week, but still towards the back, so while a small improvement, they're definitely not where they'll want to be. For drivers, I'll start with Stroll, as I've just covered Albon, and while I do think that collision's more on Albon, I think there's probably a little bit more that Stroll could have done, but that's still not his fault. At one point he was running in P9, which would have been a great result, but I think that's mainly due to others retiring rather than an impressive performance. He did defend well versus Hamilton, which is a plus, so I think it's going to be a 6.5 for Stroll. I don't think he drove badly. He had to look in for points, but then the crash with Albon, which was Albon's fault, he got the penalty. But I do think Stroll could have done a bit more, but overall the race wasn't too bad for him. Then for Hülkenberg, I imagine it was just a frustrating race. You know, he started on the hards and then really wasn't helped by the safety car. Did put him into P9, but was then just overtaken by those behind on fresher tyres and faster cars until eventually pitting when all the cars died around lap 40, finishing 12th in the end, last of the finishers. So I think 6 is probably fair, didn't do anything wrong, just wasn't helped by the strategy in the slow car. On to Alfa Romeo, and a race which could have been a lot better for them. We're definitely seeing the car has midfield potential, just not converting on this occasion. I'll start with Zhou Guanyu, and a race that just seemed to fall apart and could have been a much better result. Once again, had issues at the start, which at this point the team having 3 out of 4 bad starts, I'm inclined to say it's more likely a car issue, but still got a 5-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, but then a drive-through for not serving the penalty properly, which is the team's fault completely, not his. Still managed to get back into 11th though, almost getting points, but did have 5 cars ahead DNFing. So yeah, a lot going on. Gonna go with a 6.5. Ultimately, I think the pace was good, and besides the initial penalty, didn't really do anything badly at all, and almost picked up a point by the end. Then for Bottas, there's actually not too much to say. The notes I have him overtaking Hülkenberg and then retiring with a technical issue. He was generally running well, sort of around 8th, 9th in there with the Alpines and K-Mag, so I think he's going to get a 7. I think it was a good drive, but not overly special, and ultimately not finishing isn't his fault. Moving to Haas, and to only have 1 car in the race for this one and still pick up a couple of points even on a bad strategy, I think they'll take that. I'll just have a quick say on Schumacher, and obviously very glad he's okay. Not taking part in the race gives him a not applicable rating, which won't affect his average at the end, but yeah, very glad he's okay. On to Magnussen, and ultimately did as much as you could really ask. Started on the hards, which in hindsight didn't really work out in the big picture due to the safety car, but for K-Mag himself, I think generally drove really well. He had the pace to keep up with Bottas and the Alpines, who were on mediums during their first stint, Again, like Hülkenberg and then Hamilton, wasn't helped by the safety car, but afterwards played it as well as he could have. He battled well against Hamilton, who had the faster car, and then later on the team got the call right, stopping before the pit lane was closed. And then after that was really impressive as he got out ahead of Hamilton and made his way through the slower cars much better than Lewis, eventually finishing something like 8 or 9 seconds up the road. So I think for K-Mag, I'm going to go with an 8. I think he really did as much as he could given the strategy they'd committed to at the start and then the unfortunate timing of the safety car. Next up, Alfa Tauri, and another team with only one car in the race after Tsunoda's car died in the laps of the grid, so again, like Schumacher, has not applicable for his rating, which leaves Pierre Gasly to talk about, and kind of a quiet race, I think. The team called him in on lap 16 just before the safety car, which cost him a few places, and then after that got a bit stuck behind the McLarens, only really gaining places from those retirements in front. So while I guess unlucky with the safety car, didn't make too much of an impact afterwards, so I think it's probably a 6, which might be a little harsh, but also there's no teammate in there to judge the pace against. Did finish 8th in the end, almost 7 seconds off Norris though, and was helped by the strategies of Magnussen and Hamilton, so yeah, gonna stick with that 6. McLaren next, and definitely more encouraging than last week for sure. Obviously only one car finishing, but the pace was more towards the midfield than last week. Still probably just behind, but a definite improvement. Driver-wise, I'll start with Ricciardo. Started a little further back after impeding Ocon in qualifying, made a really early stop onto hard tyres, which meant that he jumped Lando under the safety car, and despite the tyres being almost 10 laps older than everyone else, managed to keep them and Lando behind until his car died on lap 37. Definitely much more encouraging than the pace of last week, and generally did nothing wrong, so he's going to get a 7. Plus, Lando finished 7th, so Ricciardo may well have been scoring some decent points had the car not died. Then moving on to Norris, and like Ricciardo, had quite a quiet race. The only note I have is an overtake on Hülkenberg, which isn't really much given everyone seemed to be doing it. Spent a lot of the race just behind Ricciardo, so gets a 6.5, just slightly behind, given where he spent most of the race behind his teammate. That's probably where I'd rate him for this one. And while yes, 7th is a good final position, you did have 3 retirements ahead, and then the strategies from Magnussen and Hamilton that helped him out a bit. So yeah, 6.5, good race, but not crazy good or anything. Next up, Alpine, and a very interesting race for them, where at one point it almost looked like the two cars were going to take each other out, but luckily for the team they didn't, and they ended up in a decent position by the end of the race. I'll start with Alonso and what was a really unfortunate end to his race with the car dying on him and showing the cool the car message on the steering wheel. In terms of his race, had the great battle with Ocon in the opening laps and came out ahead after all of that, which set him up nicely for a few positions up from Ocon for the majority of the race. And had he finished, probably most likely finishes 6th, which would have been a great result. So with that, it's going to get an 8. He drove well, kept it clean with his teammate, and was on for a really good result had the car not let him down. With Ocon, again, great battling in the opening laps, was a little bit on the edge with a defensive move down the straight, but generally was fine. But then because he lost out on the fighting with Alonso, was told to hold position, and so Bottas got through, and that gap to Alonso was enough to put him behind Hülkenberg after the safety car as well, and from there was generally back a little from Fernando until he retired. But then once everyone had retired, managed to hold off Norris and played that battle really well to take P6. With all that in mind, I think it's a 7.5, was behind Alonso for most of the race, so a rating just below him makes sense to me, but also did very well to get the result he did, so still a good performance. On to Mercedes, and a real tale of 2 races for both cars. They're still second in the Constructors by a point, which they'll take, and the pace was probably a bit closer to the cars ahead compared with Bahrain. With the drivers, I'll start with Russell, and it was a pretty straightforward race for him. Made the move past Ocon on lap 3, which is the only real note I have for him. It put him into P5, and then thanks to the Alpine scrapping behind, was able to gently pull away, pitted under the safety car, and actually wasn't really any quicker than Hamilton, who had tyres that were almost 20 laps older, which is something to consider, and I think overall gets him a 7.5 with it taking a knock, just because in clean air, the better tyres wasn't actually much quicker than Lewis. I think that gap went from about 4.5 seconds on lap 20 to about 7 seconds by the time Hamilton pitted. So yeah, 7.5 was still a good solid race for George. And then on to Hamilton, and what is on face value, a very bad result in 10th, just a point, but the way I'm doing these ratings is based on the race they had. Obviously if qualifying was included it would be a lot lower. Going through his race, and there are a fair few things to look at. First stint was generally stuck behind Ricciardo and Stroll for a bit and didn't get past until Ricciardo pitted, but then did make some overtakes, getting past Stroll, Norris and Gasly in pretty quick time, and made a nice move down the inside of Magnussen, and once in the clean air was setting really good lap times. Then when the VSC came out later, he couldn't make the most of it as the pit lane was closed. Once he did pit, it, didn't do too well, took a little longer than Magnussen to clear traffic, and then didn't look to have the pace to catch up, which I wouldn't be surprised if it was him and Mercedes just saying, look, there's a few laps left and you're not going to catch him, so take it easy. I think it's going to be a 7. Ultimately, I'd say the stint on the hards was really, really good. Took a while to switch on the tyres, but then once he did, overtook fairly well and had really good pace. And because of the timing of the safety car, was always going to struggle to finish 6th, and I think that's not his fault. But the stint on the mediums at the end wasn't as good, so I think a 7 is where I'll put him. Next up, Ferrari, and very nearly 2 wins from 2, but another double podium. I think they'll take it. They definitely look to be the fastest, if not second fastest, depending on the track, so a very good position for them. Starting with Sainz, and strangely enough, for a driver in 3rd place, there isn't too much to say. The main talking point was just him getting out ahead of Perez and the whole handing back of position type thing at the safety car, but otherwise lost out to Verstappen at the start and was off the pace of Leclerc a little bit, eventually finishing 8 seconds back, even with all of the fighting in front. So yeah, probably a 7.5. He was never really under threat to Perez once ahead, almost like last week, just not quite as far off the front. Then moving on to Leclerc, he looked to have really good pace, did get lucky with the safety car timing to overtake Perez, but then when it came to the battle with Verstappen, I think did everything he really could. Played it smartly at first and had a chance to get back when in P2, but the yellow flags were out at turn 1. I don't think there was much more he could have done in this one, but still drove really, really well, so gets a 9. He kept it clean, was half a second away from the win, the pace was really good, and he was pretty comfortably ahead of his teammate by the end of it all. And then lastly, Red Bull, who finally get their campaign going properly with the win. Not quite the double podium, but can't really say that that's their fault. I'll start with Perez, and generally other than the whole safety car period, there's absolutely nothing written down. He looked in decent control in the first stint, and then just got very unlucky with the timing of the safety car. Once down in P4, he just couldn't seem to move from there. For sure was better than last week, but given he was down a bit on pace after the safety car, it's going to get an 8. It's a tricky one actually, but kind of like Sainz was to Leclerc, just off the pace of the front 2, but did have that first stint which gives him the edge over Sainz's rating. Then for Verstappen, the race winner, and played the race really, really well, looked to be comfortably sat behind Leclerc in the first stint, but then once he had the chance, took it well. Learnt from the first time overtaking Leclerc that he needed the DRS on the main straight, and if I understand right, was told not to push early in the stint, which then helped him later on to get past. Overall, I'd say a 9 is about right. I don't think he could have done much better, and compared to his overtakes last week, was a lot more calculated and thought through what he needed to do to make the move stick. So yeah, overall, definitely a really good performance from him, and obviously getting the win is a big, big plus. So that rounds out the race ratings for Saudi Arabia. Looking back at this week, the ratings are maybe a touch high, but then other than the Williams drivers, nobody had particularly bad races, I don't think. Anyway, as mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more F1 content, along with leaving your thoughts, feedback and suggestions down in the comments below. And until next time, take care.